What's the plan, Tesla? Welcome back.
CyberSpace.
Empirical training. Do you know what I mean? So like empirical training.
Welcome back to the CyberSpace podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the CyberSpace podcast by Empirical Training. We're here joined today with Josh and AJ and CyberSpace podcast of Empirical Training. Empirical Training, you probably heard of us. If you haven't, we are a group of 4 former colleagues, now friends in cybersecurity, who want to share our experiences, share top tips about how you can stay secure and safe online, how you can be private, interesting, cool stuff that you can scare your friends with, but also we want to help people get into the industry. We've had some great careers so far, very much still underway, but we took unorthodox journeys into cybersecurity. And so we want to share our experience to show, hey, look, you can do it too. It isn't as scary or daunting. You don't have to go the orthodox route. If you don't know how we got into cybersecurity, episode 1 to 4, we tell you exactly how we did it, and you can hear our whole origin stories and the steps that we took along the way to where we are today. But hopefully, by keeping up these engagements, we can share a bit of our knowledge and kind of make cybersecurity more accessible, because God knows I was terrified of it when I first started, and I thought that I knew absolutely nothing and I was going to be exposed at any given moment.
Yeah, same. That's how it starts for everyone, I think, isn't it? And that's what we're trying to show here, isn't it? That even though you might be a newbie, everybody has to start somewhere, don't they, Josh? So that's what we're trying to show, that we started somewhere. We must have some knowledge to share with many other people as well. So that's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. And this is our first live podcast with an audience. We have a school community where we share lots of daily information, daily news. We have some kind of course materials on there as well to help people get into cybersecurity. And AJ had this brilliant idea. Hey, we record these podcasts anyway. Why don't we just do it with a little bit of an audience? So this will be interesting. We're going to get a bit of input from chat as we go through to kind of ask us questions, give us pointers, say what you think. I'm going to ask AJ a lot of questions because this format today, we're diving into a breach. My big book of breaches has been opened, and I'm going to look in detail into the British Library compromise, which occurred towards the end of last year. Now, why did I pick this one? That is quite a random one, but this is one where they've been really transparent. They've actually now, in March, they released the full breach report on their website, which is great because so many times you hear of breaches and we have to speculate. We guess how someone got in, what may have happened. We kind of piece together the information that they don't tell us from the little bits that they do. Corporations are terrible about this. All the lawyers come piling in and they say, don't say anything, don't admit any liability. Let's just say it was a little issue, a little hiccup, a mistake, and we've done all these things, and you can go back to buying us. But that isn't really conducive for the community, right? We are all facing the same adversaries, the same threats. Whenever they beat one of us, they multiply, right? They get stronger. This is the same kind of big boss fight that we all go up against. So it's not good enough to kind of say, oh yeah, we're fine now and don't worry about it, it was nothing. It's better if you can just share exactly what happened, share tips of how someone could avoid it next time, make sure people don't make the same mistakes, because otherwise they're just going to get more and more sophisticated.
Yeah, most definitely. And that's something that we need in the cybersecurity industry. Like, threat intelligence is such a huge thing, but you can't do it on your own. And even a company with such a specialized team in threat intelligence, they still can't do it on their own. They still need, it's better if you're a collective group and you've got multiple companies with multiple threat intelligence teams inputting into their threat intelligence platforms and sharing all the indicators of compromise. Because that is one of the things that does happen, that a company gets breached and they're not very honest about it. And then when it comes to light that something more severe happened, but they didn't tell us at the time, then you're instantly going to lose trust in that company, especially if you actively use them for maybe your day-to-day activities or you use their services and things. But yeah, if you just be honest.
Interesting. We don't seem to lose that much confidence in companies. They do still seem to carry on. We still seem to.
That's true.
Data. So maybe we need to be a bit more pitchfork and torch and go after the companies who are irresponsible. But also say, hey, okay, it's cool, you messed up. It's like a little child, right? Thanks for being honest. Thanks for telling us what happened. Now we can all move on and we can all grow from it. That's basically what we're asking the corporations of the world to do. But for now, let's focus on the British Library. And so first of all, I just want to say, we are going to be critiquing some of the things that we're going to cover, like what lessons could we learn from it? How could they have done things better? Maybe some pitfalls that we see lots of organizations fall for. But this isn't to say point fingers at the British Library. I really want to make sure that although we are going to be calling out pieces, I personally think fantastic that they've done this, and I want to encourage more people to do it. So I don't want this kind of deconstruction of it to be seen as pointing the finger and attributing blame to the British Library. Everyone gets compromised. It's not a matter of if, it's when. So when it does happen, how you deal with it and how you talk about it, that is far more valuable to me than it is that you got compromised.
Yeah, and that should be the new norm as well. Like you're saying, we're not pointing the fingers at the British Library, and we're not pointing the fingers at any company that gets breached, but usually the way that they respond to that breach that is like telling of how sophisticated or how honest the company actually is when it comes to cybersecurity. So any company that does a great write-up, we love that to bits. If we are going to point fingers, it'll be the companies that maybe were kind of a bit lackluster when it actually came to updating about that incident. But yeah, with the British Library, it looks like they were very good. So yeah, we're definitely not pointing fingers. We're just telling stories.
The point that we can talk about these things and apply the learnings elsewhere, that maybe somebody else listening can go and implement these in their daily life or in their company, or people, the analyst, aspiring analyst, you can learn. This is going to be a great one because this is going to teach you some of the basics of cybersecurity, as well as some realities, harsh realities of what you might not expect. When I went into cybersecurity, I thought, wow, it's going to be all these massive lines of code, really sophisticated attacks. Usually part of a compromise, part of an attack is something really mundane and basic. It's almost disappointing.
Sometimes it is, yeah.
Is that it? I must be missing it. But yeah, we're going to have a bit of that in here, absolutely. So let's do some level setting. People, British Library, obviously we're British. I know we have a lot of audience around the world. Who are the British Library? Well, it says what it says in the tin. They have all the books and records, also historical artifacts, and let's not get into whether they should or shouldn't have some of those under their possession. But over the last couple of decades, they've gone on a real mission to digitize a lot of this so that everyone can have access to it. Whether maybe it's a country that originally the text was taken from, they digitize it so they can share it amongst it. Everyone can kind of use these texts to research, to inform, to do education. Like universities all have subscriptions to the British Library. Historians are constantly piling through old texts, and new stuff's being added. I think this last week I heard that they found out how Socrates died because they managed to infrared an old papyrus scroll. These are the type of new things they're able to find and add because of and have it in a digitized way now, rather than you pull out a papyrus scroll, it's probably going to disintegrate in your hands. When I used to study history, Andy, we used to have to go in a certain room. You had to wear these gloves if you wanted to handle the old stuff. I can
imagine.
Yeah,
it's funny. Like the way that I operate these days is all digital, so I've kind of lost the touch to kind of the old school. Well, of going to a library and pulling a book out. It was very much, we did it in university now and again, but I was in business and IT, so it was always very digital focused. But yeah, I think it's hugely important to keep those records and digitize them, and like you say, uncover new things.
Yeah, but I've got a book in my hand for those who can't see, and there's nothing quite like having a bit of a book. And the irony is, if they had all this stuff in a book, it probably would have been safe. But that's not the way the world works these days. Maybe like the Alexandria Library that the Romans accidentally burnt down, that can happen and the data's gone forever.
Yeah, that's true.
But there may be some data missing in this one. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Andy knows nothing about this, and Andy is, he might know something, but he hasn't read the detailed breach report that I have. I've spent the last few days.
I actually know nothing about it.
Nope.
No, I don't remember this one at all, unless maybe I missed it. But yeah, I don't think I know anything about it.
Breaches happen all the time, don't they? You probably glossed over it and thought, another ransomware attack, because that's what this is. But this is great. We wanted to do this without Andy really knowing, because Andy is incident response specialist. Andy's incident response consultant. He's worked in lots of big companies. I don't know, maybe I'm doing your own intro for you, Andy, but you want to tell us why you're so good at incident response?
So I've started as a cybersecurity analyst, then moved towards more incident response, and that entails just anytime an incident occurs, trying to contain it and remove the threat as quickly as possible. And when I say contain it, that's making sure that the company can still operate and can still continue to service customers while still trying to remove the breach, and making sure that everything is removed. So sometimes it can be quite difficult in incident response that you're always wondering if the breach is actually have you got it all and it's been secured? But yeah, so that's kind of my background at the moment. I've been doing that for the last 2 years, and it's really good. It's very stressful. So if anybody's listening and you want to go into instant response, like sometimes it's not stressful because there's no incidents, but when an incident occurs, you better want to make sure you're on your A game.
Yeah, I've worked with Andy before when it's been nice and quiet, and he's been sitting there like, what shall I do? But I've also seen him, and I've sat alongside him when it's all hit the fan, and that's what instant responders are really for. They are constantly building detections and testing out processes so that when it does hit the fan, when that big critical incident does happen, you got somebody who's gonna make sure the impact is as small as possible and that you do eradicate the entire infection. Because sometimes people might not know this, you get compromised and it never makes the news because you have good incident responders in there who contain and disrupt the threat before it gets to ransomware. It's not a one and done attack. So on to the actual breach, and I'm gonna do this kind of a little bit like a story time, and I'm gonna ask Andy for input. But if you wanna ask me a question at any point, just jump in and interrupt me, and I'll tell you to hold off if I've got it in a different section. But
Sounds good.
I want to start with the impact. I want to start with how bad it was, so why this is a big real problem. So on the late October, it was announced that it wasn't announced. That's when the library found out that they had been the victim of a ransomware attack. They announced it in November, shortly after going through some of the incident response procedures, which we'll get into, and kind of said, "Hey, okay, now we have a bit of an understanding of what it is. Here's the impact." They responsibly disclosed they'd lost 600 gigabytes of data, which doesn't sound like much, but this data isn't pictures and videos. This is text, text files, personal identifiable information. It's contact numbers, it's addresses, it's all that sort of thing. It wasn't actually payment information. They managed to keep that secure because they had some stronger controls around their PCI DSS is a compliance requirement. So big win for compliance. You don't normally see that, but because they followed those, they had the payment data was unaffected. But 600 gigabytes is a lot, and you can imagine if you've ever been to the library, that could have been your data. They actually don't know the full scope yet of all the people that were affected. They have contacted everyone they have been who's been aware of it, who they've been aware has been involved in the breach. So the impact has been pretty huge on their custodian and research pieces. So like I said at the beginning, lots of universities, students will use the British Library to access the resource, access ancient text or whatever, or current text, and do their research. The way the breach was actually found, someone logged on 7 o'clock in the morning to try and go and start their work on their PhD. They couldn't get in, and they thought it was an IT issue. And eventually, they kind of called up, and then they were like, "Oh, you're not the only person. Yeah, everyone had it as locked out of this."
So this was they were computers just owned by the British Library, or anybody that had a connection to the British Library.
It was it was the workstations and laptops, so laptops, desktops were not encrypted. That was the only devices that weren't encrypted. It was the entire server estate. And getting ahead of my notes, but the reason for that, which I thought was really cool, is that they didn't say what software, but they had endpoint security software, and I'm going to assume it was EDR, endpoint detection and response, because they then said that actually blocked the encryption payload, so it stopped the hard drives, the machine from being bricked basically by being encrypted, so no one could use it. But it didn't stop the data being stolen. The data was still stolen, even from people's personal computers, even from the memory sticks that they had kind of plugged into their files. And I'll get into how they did that. But yeah, it's the server estate that actually got encrypted by the ransomware payload. So all the centralized stuff was gone. They were able to kind of carry on business as usual with people entering the library, kind of going to visit exhibitions, and so it didn't affect all of their impact. Actually, they exceeded their targets for visitors of the library. So I wonder if that was because it was in the news. Everyone's like, "Oh, this might be the last time we're going to go visit the library," or maybe they had to come in because they couldn't go online anymore. But yeah, that part was able to still function. So it wasn't completely crippling, but it stopped all of the kind of online digitized records, and they. At one point, they thought they may have been lost, but they think they've got the majority of stuff back yet, but they're still going through. They've got a lot of metadata about it, and they're trying to pinpoint all the exact files.
Oh, so they... Oh, I was going to get to that, but I assume that
This is fine.
No, I was going to say that they haven't got access back to a lot of the documents and
No, they're somewhat up and running operation. They actually gonna have to rebuild absolutely everything, pretty much. Some of it was legacy pieces, so it was so kind of old and end of life that they can't reinstall things back on it because it was not supported. So they had all this kind of technical debt. And I'll ask you in a second, whether you think that could be an issue that played its part here. But I just seen in the chat, somebody made the comment that a lot of these, I think it was after I said it was 7 a.m. they discovered it. A lot of these kind of violations happen at the beginning or the end of your day, kind of outside of office hours. My timeline is 100% that they were trying to catch you with your trousers down, so that people got their dust sleep in their eyes, or they aren't really going to jump into action. So great call out in the chat. But Andy, end of life. Can you tell us what that is? Do you know what that is? Am I putting you on the spot?
What was that? End
of life.
Yeah, so it's the software that the vendor no longer supports and is no longer going to issue any patches. So if you're running end of life software for Microsoft, for example, they're going to tell you that we're not supporting this software anymore. It's up to you to deal with it as you are. I think that's right, is it?
Absolutely right. Yeah, I put him on the spot, and he had the word perfect definition. So there's a lot of this kind of end of life software in the British Library. There's a lot of old dependencies, like technical debt, where they had to kind of have, or they said they had to have the old stuff because it was too inconvenient, too expensive at the time. They did identify it as a risk, to be fair. They said, and they had plans to slowly wean off it. But the way of the world is, I mean, I think we've seen the reality. I remember escalating Windows 2003 servers. Only in, when were we doing that, Andy? It was like 2015, 2016, maybe a bit after.
2016, yeah.
Yeah, because they were end of life. And if it's end of life, you might be doing your own patches on it, but you're probably not. You're probably neglecting the hardening it, and you're just hoping for the best and hoping no more fights.
Well, I think that's how you got to imagine it, isn't it? If the vendor, their sole job is to monitor and update that application, and you're basically just renting it, really, then how are you also going to have the time to patch it if the vendor is deciding that they don't? Yeah, it's going to be pretty much impossible, isn't it? So, yeah, be careful with end of life software like that.
Yeah, but the reality is you are going to see it all the time, and it's going to create risk. And so you see it. Obviously, the best practice is upgrade it, move yourself onto Windows 2012 would be better. I'm not sure if that's end of life at the moment, but whatever the latest Windows Server version is, and then you're going to have the vendor running doing all patches for you. And the older something is, the longer it's been around as well, people are going to be able to find exploits for this. They might keep them in their back pocket, like say, not patching them. So yeah, it created a lot of risk here, and that is part of the problem. It's also part of why my story is going to have holes in it, because they said some of the stuff was so old that it basically got destroyed, either sometimes deliberately or sometimes accidentally by the attackers trying to hide their tracks.
Okay.
So they don't have all the forensics information, which suggests to me they weren't using Seam properly, right?
Yeah. The one question I had before, so the data that's on these servers, you said that, so some of it was old, like documents that have been digitized. That is what some of the stuff was.
So, but the stuff they stole, they didn't steal like the books, right? They could have just the library and got them for free anyway, right? But they stole the personal identifiable information that they can then sell on the dark web, and that's exactly what they did. They listed it on the dark web because another massive thumbs up to the British Library. They didn't pay the ransom. They say they refused to. So that was the only way they could get the money, was by selling these records online to some scammer who's now going to come and target little old Doris who went to the British Library once. That's the way of the world. They find ways to monetize it, and they also threaten. Part of that extortion is, if you don't pay us, we'll also release that data, and they also sometimes say, and we'll also tell the data. The ICO was that's like the data compliance office.
Oh, that's happened.
Yeah. They'll tell on you, and they're going to fine you as well. Of course, British Library again did all the right things and notified the ICO as soon as possible. They were willing to take the kind of consequences by doing things the right way. So, hats off to them there. And I sympathise with their legacy software more than I do maybe some private corporations. Right? This is a public organization. It's kind of not for profit. They have some money from the government funding and actually had a lot of support from government. The NSCA, sorry, NCSA, sorry, the National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC. Forgive me. So many acronyms in cybersecurity.
So they had a lot of support from, but yeah, like you said, they're obviously not making any profit to be able to actually reinvest into new technology, which is expensive, and even having a cybersecurity team and things like that is expensive. So you can sometimes sympathize with them, and especially being the British Library is such a national treasure, really. But it's a shame that the money isn't being spent on invested really in the back end systems and things like that.
Yeah, and the irony is that now they're going to have to. So the British Library always have a reserve of 40% of its. Sorry, they always have an allocated reserve. So they have a bit of money left behind in case something like this goes wrong. They're going to have 40% of it, so £7 million going to be going on rebuilding everything and building it back a lot more secure. So hey, imagine if they used maybe half of that beforehand to rebuild everything. This is why any business, they don't take the right decisions. They kind of kick the can down the road and they hope they're going to be okay slowly because it's easier, but it ends up being more impactful and having to cost them more in the long run. So this is a great example of anyone who is talking to somebody who asks you the question, how would you make sure that people invest in cybersecurity? How can you convince board level execs, decision makers who aren't so technical, that they need to invest in cybersecurity controls now, so that they don't have to invest in repairing everything and then adding more controls later?
Yeah, that's the thing. You don't want to really be reactive. Like, you want to put the main security controls in place. Like, every company should always assume that they've either been hacked or they currently are hacked. It's always good to have that mentality instead of thinking, oh, it's never going to happen to me, because at some point it will happen. So it's better to try and put preventative measures in place and have that network up to speed before you're trying to react to it and potentially, in this case, losing a lot of sensitive data.
Yeah, and so I'll give you now the kind of timeline of what happened, the steps they took by the incident response, and after that we'll go into the timeline of what they've told us and what we might be able to decipher from what the attackers did. So we're going to start now at the point at which they realize, oh, we've been ransomed. And okay, have a guess. Well, I already told you. I was going to ask you to guess, how did they find out that they'd been ransomed? And it was an alert.
EDR.
User. No, it wasn't even. They didn't even. EDR alert was afterwards. When they checked things.
Okay. Oh yeah, when we went to log on.
And that's what people often don't think that, but people are your alerts as well, right? Somebody saying, "Oh, something doesn't feel quite right." So encouraging anybody, whoever they are in the business, to kind of be able to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, IT. I'm sorry, security, corpsec, whoever you are. This feels a bit odd." That's a great way you can catch attacks even before they're this obvious. But obviously at this point, nothing's working. That's pretty obvious.
It's a good point, because in a lot of the companies that I've worked for, having users being able to submit security tickets, like some users have submitted a ticket just to say, I've received this spreadsheet and it's kind of trying to trigger a macro and it's trying to make me install this software and I'm not sure about this, and instantly, because sometimes the EDR might miss things like that. It depends on the EDR. And
what do you say to those people? Like if it's malicious or if it's legitimate, how's your response to them?
I always go straight in with the investigation and making sure that you know exactly what's going on, and then when we've ultimately decided if it definitely is malicious, like it was in this case with the embedded macro, we tell them that this is malicious, and potentially they might have even triggered the macro and installed the application that the macro was trying to execute, and you have to tell them that we've got to lock down your machine, and it's not their fault because they still alerted to you. Like, everybody makes mistakes, but they actually got to the point where they tried to recover from the mistake, and it might have got a little bit worse if they didn't say anything. So I always praise them after.
Yeah, praise. Sorry. That shame that you can sometimes feel, oh, I'm an idiot, or I'm going to lose my job. It's much better if you come clean with it early, and so we can there might still be a chance. We still have a chance.
Yeah, no, it's something that we've been talking about internally, about praising employees who raise tickets after the incident.
Did you have an Amazon voucher or something because he could have caught it, or were you like,
That's management's choice, that is, if they want to give that away. But I think
£20
it's,
voucher goes a long way, I'll tell you that.
yeah, that's true. I remember the first company we were working with, and it got a couple of Amazon vouchers, and I bought loads of random stuff for my car.
Yeah, you could. I think I've actually bought. It was my 30th on the weekend, and I bought smoke machine fluid for it, Andy,
Oh, nice. Oh,
with
yeah,
with a voucher from work.
happy birthday, by the way. I
Oh,
couldn't
thank you.
make it for your 30th birthday, but it looked like an extravaganza.
I realize I've just aged myself. I like to be a bit more mysterious than that. Might have to edit that bit out. But hey, the we're now into the next timeline, so I'm going to run through this. I'm not going to read all the points; they are more detailed than I'm going to be, but I'm going to pick out for me what are the key pieces. So, after that call, they get technology alerts confirming, oh yeah, that this has ransomware is everywhere. The EDRs did block the payload, but then we've also seen other consequences of the ransomware encryption payload. They alert all the gold and the gold crisis team, who I believe they seem to talk about gold and silver and bronze employees. I think it's the level of how they're employed in the British library. But yeah, so they begin. The technology is gathered. The host servers are taken offline, so they're trying to contain everything. I mean, it's kind of, to be honest, it's kind of dumb to, once everything's encrypted, to take them offline. Like they're encrypted. You can't really even pivot off them now. But also, they don't know if maybe the attack is still in place. Maybe they are going to try and find a way, because the endpoints were blocked, right, with the encryption payload. Maybe they're going to move on to then. So it does make sense. Pull everything offline while you can investigate exactly what happened. It's called containing the threat, and it buys you time to work out what the proper remediation action is, because it doesn't fix anything, but it just buys you time.
Yeah, usually it's better just to disconnect it from the network, from the EDR, so you can still do your analysis on there. Because then, if you take it offline completely, you might lose some.
You put your one legitimate shell into there so you can still access it, but attackers shouldn't be able to.
Yeah, but then that could go wrong. But usually that is one of the good ways to contain it. Because if they take it offline completely, then well, like you say, it's encrypted anyway, so it is still difficult for any users to access any information. But sometimes, you can lose some artifacts for your analysis that might help you, like things in memory, for example. If they were injecting things into memory, we would no longer see it if they turned it offline. But it is difficult knowing exactly what to do sometimes.
Yeah, and we don't actually have that level of detail of exactly what forensic data they were able to pull after the fact, and what stuff they had in like a centralized SIEM. So we talk a lot of people about, that's your first job as security analyst, you'll be working a SIEM probably, and that houses the data off-site in a kind of immutable storage, so that the attackers can't go and delete it, because that's actually what they did on a lot of the machines that were pulled forensically. They had deleted logs, they had turned off certain logging controls, so they literally hidden their tracks.
So it's a shame as well, because those type of alerts, they're actually quite easy to set up, like turning off login and things like that. So obviously the user did alert them when they actually logged in, but alerts like that are actually quite simple to set up in a SIEM. So if you ever join a company as a cybersecurity analyst, sometimes just look at the most basic alerts and just see if they're in place. Like, you can easily set those up. Like turning off login, it's just like a yes or no output in the log. So you can easily set that up. You don't have to be a master. Like, a lot of the alerts I make are actually quite basic alerts. I'm not very skilled at writing queries, but usually they're quite good because they're quite niche, but they're quite simple. So that's the thing. People always assume that you have to be super sophisticated and it has to be all these steps, where it's like, well, the attacker's going to have to do at least one of those things. So just focus that on your alert and then build it from there.
It's about finding, if you can find common components of a compromise. And hey, I might not know exactly the fancy exploit they use, but I know the techniques they're going to have to use to get to their end objective. So let's focus on those ones. It's about prioritization, where your analytics are deep there. Andy doesn't do himself justice, but that he is good at his dissections. But that is a very, very simple one. Do you remember calling people up when we were in the SOC together and saying, hey, someone's turned off your login? Because that is a sign of an attacker trying to hide something. It did used to annoy a lot of people, because I don't think it wasn't all, it's not always actually an attacker doing it. And they're like, oh, get up for this. That sounds so kind of simple. But it's so impactful. If it was an attacker and they've turned off the login, one, we've identified an attacker that we don't know how initially got in there, so we can trigger threat hunting. But two, if they turn off login, whatever they do next, we can't see it. And so we can't see it, what happened fix it. So yeah. So moving on with this, just quickly, the crisis stuff they did. So they notified all the right people. I don't think I go into too much information. They're kind of confirming the scope of all this first, so they can see that actually the physical security and the fire alarms are still working, because they want to know if they can still have people in the building. They have the next day. They move into actually disabling or resetting the Microsoft 365 accounts for their gold and silver staff. They start turning on to paper processes for their ticketing systems and so on. So they start to be a little bit of business continuity in there by making sure that the library still work like it used to.
I always find that nuts when the companies switch back to a paper-based system, and you're always thinking, well, yeah, you kind of have to, like you say, for business continuity. But then you always think like, oh, maybe we should just stick with a paper-based system. We can't hack that.
There's a reason we moved on to IT, right? It's so much more. It saves a lot of time and money. But this is the other side of it. This is why cybersecurity is so big. And so that's the next day. They reported it to the ICO as well. They also confirmed that payroll systems weren't affected. And so that's quite interesting. The things like payroll, there's some HR pieces as well that they had. They weren't affected because they were hosted in the cloud. So they had migrated some things to the cloud. Data there.
Do you know what they migrated to if they went to AWS? Or
I don't know which cloud provider it is. Maybe if someone in the chat will have a little quick Google, because I'm quite curious. But the following day, so on October 30th, now 2 days after the breach, they've starting to confirm the scope of the backups have been compromised as well. So the attackers had not only managed to get the data and encrypt the data on the machines, they'd actually wormed their way into the backups locations as well, and that data too. So they couldn't even restore from the last saved state, which is actually really common. If anyone says, "Oh, I don't worry about ransomware, I've got disaster recovery," how good is disaster recovery? Even disaster recovery as a service, which is where you get someone else to do it off-site, can be you can work around that by. I've seen attackers wait; they work out what the schedule is for the backups, and then when it's a second before it's about to start backing up, deploy encryption everywhere. That means that then backups is still less effective than it would have been. You're still going to lose some data.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, that's always the assumption with ransomware, isn't it? That if you have backups, then you're going to be all right. But if it's not done correctly, then
and apart from the stuff they sell online as well. But I think before the double extortions, where they used to take the data and sell it in the dark web, people did just believe that the backups were enough to sort them out from ransomware. So at this point, they're confirming the full scope of the data. They've actually started to talk to the ICO because they realize how much data there is out there. They can start to name what pieces have been stolen. I said a lot of PII, not the payroll stuff, no payment pieces, but a lot of sensitive information that's been worth money on the dark web. I think I said 600 gigabytes earlier, but it was 500,000 records. So that might put it in more perspective. Half a milli. And great. Okay, so now on to Halloween, October 31st, a few days afterwards. They're continuing to reset staff passwords. So they're basically now we don't really know what's wrong. Let's just try and reset everything because one of those accounts has been compromised. And there's a few other pieces that they've done that aren't super interesting to us as security analysts. And then November 1st, the NCC, National Crime Center, advised that all corporate laptop and desktop users should be ceased immediately. So the specialists that they've got involved, this is a government agency, so they have had government support come in, have now said, even those endpoints, you can't use those now, even though the ransomware's blocked them, we think we've got everything. So days after, they're realizing, hang on, we might have found something more. We don't really know the full scope of this. So it shows that that's the timeline they've given. And after that, I think they started to just kind of slowly put things back together. But that was how many days was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days of absolute panic for that instance piece.
Okay.
And
long time.
I know, Andy, that's kind of the less interesting stuff, but I wanted to just kind of show what has to happen after a breach, after you detect ransomware. We're going to go into now how they got to the point of delivering ransomware in the first place. But any thoughts or questions you have for me on that part?
Yeah, no, I think it is very interesting to cover that part. And even with, I know you mentioned 5 days, that actually does sound like quite a long time, but in incident terms, that's actually pretty good
They're not
Fair.
back up and running in 5 days. 5 days is just seems to be where they work
Oh,
out
they-
the scope of, oh crap.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, okay. That's a long time.
Running. They expect it to be in mid-April, but they're still working on it.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's been a really long time then. So 5 days to kind of figure out what's going on is a bit too long as well, to be honest. Like, after the fact, yeah. But yeah, overall, it seems to make sense.
We didn't see any more attacks occur in that. So the attackers, you might think there's more stuff to come. The attackers had just fully made off with everything and we're done with it. So that I thought was quite interesting. But this is the real interesting bit. Well, it's interesting to some degree, but also they don't have all the pieces. I'm gonna have to say that again. I would love to know the exact exploits they used, but unfortunately, this is what they say. Forensic investigation analytics of records indicate strong likelihood that the criminals actors initially gained access at least 3 days before the incident became apparent, but it's unlikely that we'll ever get a definitive answer because of the exact timing of the entry into Live's estate and the overly destructive nature of the attack. So the timing, Chat said this earlier, they do it outside of business hours. Yeah, they did it at 1 o'clock in the morning was when they first saw an alert that was linked to it. And a lot of this stuff seems to happen in the middle of the night. And unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to leave it for now. There is more detail to uncover, even though a lot of things were destroyed as part of the tactics of the adversaries. But next episode, we're actually going to drill into who it was that infected the British Library, all the pieces of information they were able to share about the steps of the breach, including point of entry or potential points of entry, including alerts that were created and investigated and that might have been precursors to the actual most impactful parts of the attack, which weren't alerted on. They also shared a lot of lessons that they've learned, stuff that we've alluded to already in this episode of the podcast, because they naturally come out as and when we talk about them. But they very gratefully so have shared a list of top tips that other organizations in a similar sector or not need to take on in order to avoid becoming a similar victim in the same way that they were. So we're going to dissect as much as we can about the key steps of the attack sequence, of how they gained entry, how they moved laterally, how they stole all the data, and how they're able to deploy ransomware payloads and encrypt the machines without somebody discovering their presence before that. So all of that to be covered in the next episode, of course, with Andy's expert insight as an incident responder into what he would have done, whether this kind of compares to stuff that is normal or not, and asking the probing questions along with the chat as to find out exactly what we think happened and what we think could have been done better to maybe avoid it. But again, thank you so much to the British Library for sharing this information. There aren't enough breach reports in the public domain like this one, and I recommend anybody who is intrigued by today and maybe doesn't want to wait till next week to find out all the information, to go and check out that report. It's about 30 pages long. It's really good. It's not too complicated. There's a lot of, it's very accessible. So regardless of where you are in your cybersecurity knowledge or journey, there's some stuff in there that can really show you how this plays out in the real world, right? Not just the news headlines that you see, but actually the kind of step-by-step components that have to occur, as well as the pieces of the puzzle as to how they actually got there. But of course, we'll be adding our own insight and our own take on what it is we can glean from the report. The report doesn't share everything, even though this is one of the best ones I've seen coming forth with this in the public domain. So we still have to fill in some of the gaps and assess as to what could have been the case had the data still been available, or had there been better threat detection and response programs in place. So plenty more to come, even if you do read the report in the meantime, plenty more value that we can add. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us once again. This is the Empirical Training Podcast, the CyberSpace podcast, a safe space for us to talk about cybersecurity developments, cybersecurity insights, and hopefully get people more comfortable with cybersecurity so that they could maybe see themselves in there in the profession, taking their first role as a security analyst, just like we did all those years ago. Or people just able to advance their cybersecurity knowledge, advance their career, maybe just stay abreast of it if your job actually touches on cybersecurity a little bit, but you think, hey, it'd be better if I knew a little bit more of this, even though it's not directly in my wheelhouse. So hopefully there's a lot of real world information that we shared today. And next week will be a real summary of more details on the attack sequence, but also summary of all the lessons that can be learned from the British Library ransomware compromise. So thanks again to them. Thanks for you to listening. I've been Josh. This has been the CyberSpace podcast, and that is a wrap.
CyberSpace podcast.
You know what I mean? So like